Where to start? It's great to be in Europe again. You know, I know the Europeans always think we think without acting, which obviously, excuse me, act without thinking, because obviously we have a president who acts without ever thinking. But it's really great to come to a continent in which they think without acting. Europeans love to have conferences. To be serious for a moment, I actually want to preface my remarks by two things. First of all, I think the European Union is the most important experiment in human governance since the establishment of my country in 1776. The extraordinary thing about our country is that it was established with two documents, and both those documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, seek to raise the level at which we expect things from our government and change the relationship between not only human beings, modeled mostly after John Locke, but also in which we define the notion that the government works for us rather than the other way around. That was an extraordinary thing to do in 1776, capped off by one of my two political heroes, George Washington, not because he was the first president of my country, but because he was the first person, as democracy was emerging in its present form, who declared that the office was more important than the person that was in it. And by refusing a third term, he did that. It was an extraordinary moment. The European Union is even more extraordinary, because what you're attempting to do in Europe, which is the most violent continent on the face of the earth for 1,000 years, is extinguish nationalism and religion as a source of war. And I think there are older folks who've been around when the European Union was started and who may remember, if not personally, certainly through their parents, what happened after what was left after World War II. They understand this. I think Angela Merkel understands this. I think the younger Europeans, who are much more European in some ways than the older Europeans, I think are struggling to understand why the European Union is so important. And I think it's critical, as I begin to speak about populism, that we understand why the EU has to survive. It's not just about Europe. It's about raising the bar and the expectations that we all have for each other. And it's about doing what humans have done over 5,000 years or more of civilization, which is to try to build institutions that contain the bad, unpleasant parts of humanity, which are raising their head now in the force of populism as we see around the country. And the way you do that is not to change human nature, although it would be nice. It is simply to build institutions that are strong enough to withstand people like Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen. And it's not easy to do. And before I dig into my remarks, I want to say one other thing about history. One of the nice things is there are not many things, I'm 68 years old, there are not many things that are nice about being 68, except that I'm not 78 yet. But one of the things that's terrific is that, as my father once told me when we were going through our wars that 20-year-old emerging young men do when they're with their fathers, and the things have begun to settle down, we began to sort of take a new place with each other and each other's lives. And he once said to me, I still have an advantage over you. And I said, what is it? And he said, I can look backwards as well as forwards. And at the time, I thought, well, this is more fidel in one ear, not the other. But here I am telling you the story 50 years later, so obviously I remembered it. And what I tell, especially the younger people in this room, is that if you look backwards, things have been changed remarkably for the positive in the world. It's impossible to see that when you're in your 20s and your 30s because you don't have the experience. So 40 years ago, roughly, 50 years ago, I was a freshman at Yale University, a first-year student in my second semester in the spring. And my two roommates were African American. Neither of them had ever been to school with a white person before, because they went to segregated schools in the South. I had never been to school with a black person before, because I went to a fancy prep school in northern New England. That was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. 99 American cities were burned down. Some never recovered for 25 years. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, and the Democratic Convention in Chicago picked a candidate for President of the United States in the back rooms who had run in only about 5 primaries. And the whole place blew up for a week, and which was later classified as a police riot. If you could have told us in the spring of 1968 that we would have a black president in the United States of America 40 years later, we would have told you you were insane. And 40 years later, not only do we have an African-American president, during his time in office, which I had a lot to do with in this case, 2 men who fall in love with each other or 2 women who fall in love with each other are allowed to get married. That wasn't even on the radar screen when I was in college. You didn't dare, when I was in high school, you didn't dare tell anybody you were gay or you'd get beat up before you got out of the parking lot. So, we have a long way to go. But starting a talk like this with a little history about how far we've been just in the last 50 years is pretty extraordinary. We have a long way to go, and we can't lose sight of that. And the great thing about young people is they're incredibly impatient, and without their impatience, change never happens. But I think it's important for us to share our experience that, in fact, you do make change. But it is hard, and we are at a crisis point. I was incredibly amused by the fake news panel because it is a real problem. There's a very interesting study out that shows the only way to combat fake news is to be there first with the right story. Because whatever story gets there first is the one that's hard to refute. So fake news beats it. Refuting fake news is futile, not just because of the emotional investment that people have in not believing the truth, but also if you get there second, you have a long uphill. But the New York Times was printing fake news for years. So was Washington Post. Judith Miller helped get us into the Iraq War. Even the story last spring with Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation supposedly taking a big contribution from some oligarch who then got it, into some big nickel mine in Russia. And when you actually dug into the story, the timelines were off and it wasn't true at all. I mean, that's because it's ratings driven. I have an MSNBC contract, as Rick mentioned, and I turned to the producer one time and I said, why is Trump always on here? Can you imagine Tim Rusk letting Trump on while he's padding around his apartment with his pajamas on and his slippers in the morning? Why do you let Trump on? He says, all about the ratings. And then a quote from the president of CBS News, Les Moonves, after the election says, this may not be good for America, but it was damn good for CBS. Well, I mean, it's not just fake news that's killing us, it's our own news media. Because they've lost their sense of what their value is in a democracy. I actually think they're getting it back. I'm reading the Washington Post now for the first time in 15 or 20 years. It was basically an inside Beltway gossip rag. And now Dave Fahrenthold, who I think is a fantastic reporter, just won a Pulitzer Prize for doing what no other paper did, which is actually report the news about Trump and do the work. And I think other papers are now beginning to find their mojo. Cable news is up 18%, but that's not because it's accurate. That's because it's entertainment and everybody loves reality TV, which is what our country's presidency has become. So I was asked to talk a little bit about populism and some other topics. Let me do that. Populism is there's a long string of it. It goes back for a long time. What I tell people that I do teaching at a few universities on a variety of subjects, but one of the things I tell the young people is, who I don't think understand this, or I think they've forgotten it because we haven't had an enormous conflict for a while. Politics is a substitute for war. Unless you understand that politics is a substitute for war, you can't understand politics. The reason there's so many jackasses in politics and mean people is because that's who goes to war. Politics is about asset allocation and succession. Well, war, it was always the means until the last few hundred years of asset allocation and succession. We just had the French Revolution in the United States of America and nobody went to the guillotine. At least Trump hasn't talked about that yet. I'm expecting it any day. Bannon, certainly. But that's progress. That is progress. It is a tough, tough business that we're in. We are arguing about huge amounts of money. We are arguing about huge amounts of power. I think we have to keep in perspective, and campaign managers know this, that politics is a substitute for war. And I think when things get like as they are now, it's very disturbing and very unsettling, and when there's violence and racism and all these isms that human beings participate in from time to time, we have to realize politics is a substitute for war. It's a particularly nasty time to be doing politics in the West right now. What is the real cause of populism? I agreed with a lot. I thought the panels this morning were terrific. And I think there was a very good discussion of this, so I'm not going to get deeply into it. I completely agree with the notion that the reason fake news and populism are so successful is because people are so deeply emotionally involved in that part of the world. I mean, in that view of the world has become part of their psyche, and they can't listen to logical arguments because it would actually cause them to, if this was a possibility, go into psychotherapy for 15 years. And this is not the population that's going to do that. But what is the real cause of this? Well, first of all, we talked about the changes already. And I thought somebody earlier on made the point, which actually is in a book by Arlie Hochschild called Strangers in Their Own Land. It was a woman from San Francisco who went to live in the Bayou country in Louisiana. And somebody this morning asked a question, might have been Walter, about people feeling that people are pushing in line ahead of them. And Arlie went down and wrote a book about people who are doing it. I recommend you can get the book if you want to understand at least what's happening in the United States. What I say is these are the people who have had white privilege all their life. They're losing it and they never knew they had it. And it is a shocking thing to see the changes of the sort that I opened this talk with, discussing the vast social changes in America, and be left behind. But it's worse. Globalization has left a whole ton of people behind in the West, all the Western countries, and not just the West. Now, there are some lies about globalization. The biggest lie is that trade is a bad thing. That is a lie. My party was the ones that perpetrated that lie. It is a lie. 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in the world in the last 20 years since global trade has exploded. Many of them in China, but 1 billion is 1 billion. Africa is developing a middle class because of trade. So it is true, and the reason my party, and now Trump, of course, has adopted the lie because it's been very effective, has talked about this, is because if you go to specific places in Iowa or Ohio, there are specific areas where people have moved plants, lost jobs, and their jobs have been set up in Mexico. That's true. But for the most part, trade creates jobs, as Trump found out when his Secretary of Agriculture, who's a very conservative ex-governor of Georgia, called and said, if you do this, you're never going to win Iowa again, because agricultural jobs in Iowa depend on exporting enormous amounts of agricultural products all over the country. So that's the problem number one. We have lied to a lot of people who now blame globalization. Problem number two is the economy is moving so fast that even if our training programs were great, which they're not, once you lose your job and you're 55 years old in my country, you're never going to get another one, and if you do, it's going to pay $10 an hour doing something with no benefits. Because if you don't know how to use the internet, and I mean well, I don't know how to use the internet well, but I'm in a position so I can hire smart people who did, too. And my whole campaign, I get all this credit for revolutionizing the American campaigns. This is the guy that helped do that. The truth is, neither one of us knew a damn thing about the internet. We didn't have any money. We had a very powerful message, which was, you have the power. And we let the 23-year-olds do whatever they damn well please. And they were the ones that revolutionized campaigns. So if you can't get a job, when you're 50, what do? Your whole definition of your identity is tied up in your work. And now you can't provide for your family. That's the problem number one. Problem number two, and this is very bad news for all of us, and for anybody in the sort of leadership class, there is a problem that is coming along that people are just barely beginning to talk about, which is going to be a problem that's going to affect everybody in the world and every government in the world in a way that I don't think we have any idea what we're going to do about, and that is automation. River Rouge is an enormous automobile plant near Detroit, and it went broke, or almost went broke. It was almost closed. And today, it is manufacturing as many cars as it was 20 years ago, with 1/3 of the workforce, because robotics are picking these cars up and moving them around, so forth and so on. China wants to become the leader in robotics. God help them if they do, because how the hell are they going to employ the 100 million people that they require to employ in order to have stability? which is their number one. The reason they want the country's economy to grow so fast is not just about more money and power. It's about their long 5,000-year histories of watching from the periphery dynasties collapse because they weren't able to figure out how to keep people happy and gainfully employed in the provinces. We don't have any idea how to deal with it, and it's going to continue to happen. And it's a major, major problem. Right now, it affects blue-collar people. It's going to affect white-collar people when artificial intelligence gets to a position where we can start replacing people who do research and answer phones. They already do that, but it's incredibly awful. In fact, some budding entrepreneur here should actually start a company where real people answer the phone without any of these messages. And you're going to put a lot of people out of business, which would be a good thing. But automation is an enormous problem. We're going to have very serious discussions about a guaranteed income for doing nothing. That goes against everything I was taught. And I do think identity has always been tied up in work for men, and now as women become more and more successful and become more and more greater leadership, exert leadership in the economy, it's going to be part of women's identity as well. What do we do about that? I mean, there are experiments. There's a small experiment in Toronto, which I didn't know until I had a meeting with some Canadians a couple of weeks ago for 4,300 people. The Finns, I think, have 100,000 people on a guaranteed basic income. So we have to have that debate. But that is a powerful, powerful problem that everybody in the world, as our population expands, the amount of work being done is expanding even faster. I'll give you the stats for the United States. Our manufacturing industry today, all our manufacturing, is 2/3 larger than it was 20 years ago. 2/3 larger. We have 2/3 of the workforce. Pardon me, it's 87% larger. It's 87% larger than it was 20 years ago. Our manufacturing industry. That's so much for all the plants going to Mexico and all this stuff, right? The workforce in manufacturing is 2/3 of the size it was 20 years ago. 2/3 of the people are doing nearly twice as much work. That's the productivity that you get using robotics, AI, the internet, and every country in the world is going to face that. So what do? I concur with a lot of the very good recommendations from this morning, and as we go on, how to deal with populism. I thought Celinda, I'm as big a fan of hers as she is as mine, and I thought that her insights into our messaging are important. I don't think the Democrats necessarily going to get this on time. I think, to be really dismal, Trump could get reelected. I don't think he's going to get impeached, though. I know people don't understand how impeachment works, but basically, 2 presidents in our life have been impeached, in our country's history have been impeached, and neither have been removed from office. You have to have 67 votes in the Senate, that's the 2/3, to remove somebody from office in the United States. It's not going to happen. It is not going to happen. It didn't happen when Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat with a Republican Congress after the Civil War, he lost by a single vote, and it certainly didn't happen with Bill Clinton. In fact, it boosted his popularity to 60%. Which is pretty extraordinary, considered. So he's not going to be removed from office, and if he were, I wouldn't recommend it anyway, because Pence is worse. Pence is more controlled. He's a right-wing ideologue, a hardline ideologist who doesn't give a damn what the facts are. Trump makes his own facts up, which is a little scary, but apparently once in a while does listen to reason, as he did when he backed off getting rid of NAFTA, although he could change his mind tomorrow. So we're not going to see Trump removed from office. We have to have a message, and we do not have one. And the message can't be, a publisher once told me you can't sell a negative. You can't. You have to have a positive message. Our message simply can't be just Trump is awful. Now that will be enough, maybe, I think, to take back Congress in 2018, because anger does move people to the polls. I remember Karl Rove in 2004 put gay marriage on the ballot, which is not a good place for social change, in 16 states with the hope it would crank up the evangelical turnout and he would win those states, and it worked. I think the problem is, anger may motivate people, but it's not the long-term motivator. The real long-term motivator, and Bill Clinton understood this better than any president since Franklin Roosevelt, was hope. And we have to have a candidate that's hopeful. I'm hoping almost certainly going to refuse on ageism grounds not to support anybody over 55, and I'd like to do 50. It is time our generation got the hell off the stage. We are very lucky because we're living to a much older age and we're capable to a much older age. Our most important demographic is people under 35 years old. They voted 58% for Hillary Clinton, although they didn't turn out for an enthusiastic reason. They elected Barack Obama, the only election in my lifetime where more people under 35 voted than over 65. Not percentage-wise, but numbers-wise. They elected Barack Obama president of the United States. Twice. They're not Democrats. They're not Democrats. They don't vote in down-ballot elections. They don't vote for senator of the House or school board or anything like that. They don't vote in off-year elections, which is why 2010 and 2014 happened. Not only are they not Democrats, they don't vote institutions. They don't care about institutions. They don't like institutions because they don't need them. When we were protesting against the Vietnam War, it took us 7 years of running around and more increasingly violent activity against the government, plus Nixon having to resign in disgrace to end the war. They go online, they get 500,000 people who agree with them on some business, and they go out and they do it. They essentially were a big part of the issue that made Mike Pence back off on his anti-gay bill in Indiana. They got rid of an intellectual property bill that would have forced Utah to off the air. One of the few bipartisan bills passed in the Senate and or brought to the Senate floor, and Harry Reid, after 3 days of getting pummeled by this generation, pulled the bill. I know there's thousands and thousands of young people who don't want to go into politics. Why? Why would you want to make your career spewing hot air for 30 years when nobody pays a damn bit of attention? I have a young lady, I judged an internet contest after I did the campaign, $100,000 prize for DoSomething.org. And we met this woman, she didn't get the prize, which I thought she should have, but she did. She was 18 years old, she was about 21 at the time. She was going to LaGuardia High School in New York, then went by some quirk, went to the University of Vermont. Her mentor sent her over to South Sudan. There, at 18, she concluded that American foreign aid made people more dependent, not less dependent, which I think is true. She came back. We would have said, okay, we're going to join USAID, or we're going to go into Congress or into politics. She went online. She got a roommate from her friend from across the hall. They started a little something or other called Sparks Micro Grant. You all want to look at it. And she got a grant from some foundation for $1,000 in New York. Today, she's 28. She runs $1 million a year operation. She has 100 African college graduates as employees. She is in Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda, teaching essentially democracy without talking about democracy. They give fixed grants for projects. The village gets to choose what the projects are. They have to build them. They have to maintain them. In order for that to happen, since it's a patriarchal society where the men give the orders and the women do the work, they have to have the women sitting in the planning because the men aren't going to do the work, so they have to have the women in. It has remarkably changed everything about how these villages run in these 3 states. And Paul Kagame, I caution Sasha against, need to be careful about this, has asked them to start running rural elections in Rwanda. And as of having done that, there have been 6 headmen in the village elected. 2 of him are not headmen, they're head women. I can't imagine, this is an 18-year-old who's done more to transform rural African society in these 3 countries than USAID with a gazillion-dollar budget has for years. Why would you do this if you were in this generation? And you know, it doesn't have to be do-gooder stuff. What about the guy who's got some shoe company that I never heard of? Every time he sells a pair of shoes in the United States, somebody in Africa, a poor kid in Africa, gets a free pair. Somebody here knows what the name of the shoe company is. I'm too old. What is it? Tom's. Okay. There, hundreds and thousands of these kids have done this. Why would they care about institutions? So I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing in the States. So my view of this is, I was on 3 university campuses right after the Trump debacle, and there was really grieving. I mean, the university president was sending around offers for grief counseling on campus, and I actually participated in the grief counseling. My favorite was the report I got from West Point, because I teach, among other places, at the Yale-Jackson Institute. I teach a foreign policy course, and we're very close to the West Point thing, which I think is good, because I think after, as a child of the Vietnam era, I think it's good to integrate Americans back together again, military and civilians. So, there's a lot of grief and a lot of gnashing of teeth, and finally one of the professors says, well, I was just up at West Point, and I said, well, what did you find? What did they say? He said, well, first of all, if the election had been held on the campus of West Point, Hillary Clinton would have won in a landslide. Why? Because if you're going to be an Army officer, you're automatically an internationalist, and you'd like the same person running the country if you could have one. And I said, well, what did they say about the terrible disappointment? He said, well, I had somebody come up, and I asked him about that. He said, sir, we're used to getting bad news, sir. Sir, when we get bad news, sir, we do something about it, sir. I thought, okay, guys, take a lesson from that. Enough angst and grief, right? Just do something about it. Exactly what they're doing. So our plan is this. I think the Trump victory in the United States may have provided an opportunity, for this generation to get involved in institutions. Things are so bad. This is such a shock. This was a rejection of every value that people under 35 in my country hold dear. They value diversity. They value respect for women. They value immigration. They value tolerance. They value libertarian economic ideas. They would be consider voting Republicans, except they're not going to vote for bigots and misogynists or right-wing whack jobs, which is essentially the composition of the Republican Party for the last 20 years. Or how they, in fairness to the Republican Party, that's what they're advertised as. Because, of course, the people who say outrageous things are the ones that get on the paper, and that brands the Republicans. Just as we used to be branded by all the far left when I was growing up. I tell the kids, I said, the far right hasn't always been like this. There is no left in my country now. I remember when there was a left. They were burning down buildings and blowing things up and all this kind of stuff. Now there's no left. There's no Bernie's a left, guys. He'd be a centrist in England, for God's sakes, in Corbyn's party. So, it's all relative, but the media has tarnished, in some ways, deservedly so, I think, and made the Republicans a far-right party. And so they're not going to vote for them, even though economically they might, if they didn't have all these horrible social views on all their friends. So can we get them into the Democratic Party? The answer to that is absolutely not. Not as the Democratic Party's institutions are currently put together. We have to start, they already have institutions. They're incredibly ad hoc. For example, Indivisible has set up all the town meetings, which I think killed Trump Care. And that's set up by a bunch of staffers from Congress who were, not ex-staffers from Congress, they're 35, 40 years old. They know how to use the internet, and they get thousands of people to go to these town meetings that are held by Republicans. Run for something. Headed by an ex-Hillary staffer who's recruiting people to run for Congress. Run for school board. That's really important. We haven't done that for 8, 12 years. To run for school board, to run for local office, assembly, and so forth and so on. Swing left. They're looking at the 53 places in which we have Hillary, which Hillary won, then we have Republican congressmen. And they intend to target them. And so our idea is to take 10 or 12 of these folks, institutions, fund them, let them do whatever they want with 2 conditions in return for the funding. 1, they work together. 2, they stay in their lanes, and if they're not going to stay in their lanes, they have to talk to each other. That's all. Because I don't think we can, generation after generation after thousands of years of generations, young people come into our institutions and they socialize the institution a little bit, and the institution mostly socializes them. This has to be at least 50-50. We're not hostile to the DNC or the DCCC. In fact, one of the biggest problems we have is how do we mesh the databases, because that's a very, I'm not going to go into all this because it's too complicated. But it's really complicated. We're already using a database, and to throw it out the window would be enormously problematic in the middle of what is a perpetual campaign. But our thinking is that let them run the institutions the way they want, let them design their own institution with a little help and advice from us, but no direction from us. And then the DNC will come to them. Swing left has already worked with state parties, and so has run for something. Why? Because state parties are in charge of electing. We're not looking to transform the DNC from within and take it over. We're looking to transform it from without, simply by providing the functions that they can't provide, because they're so busy, behaving like probably everybody in every country capital in the world is. Washington is essentially middle school on steroids. And who did what to who? I know Brussels was like that because I spent a lot of time here. So the bottom line is, this is a disaster. Trump is a disaster. A lot of bad things are going to happen, particularly if he pulls out of the climate change, the Paris Agreement next week. But this is to be understood as at an inflection point for our species on the planet, where we are now designing machines that can replace us. And what happens to those of us that have to make such incredible, disastrous change? And how do we guide that change? And the answer is we don't know, but we better be a step ahead of all the people who claim they know and don't. We have a real problem on our hands. Positivity is necessary to guide this. Thinking and trying different things. The truth is, a lot of these people, including young people, are actually questioning whether democracy is the right form of government. That's very frightening, but it's the right question to ask, because Wall Street, which has been the bastion of capitalism for years, has to make short-term decisions because they have quarterly earnings they have to live up to. That's why they behave so badly. And politicians have a 2-year horizon, and that's why they behave so badly. So these are major questions that we ought to be thinking through. And the floor is pretty much wide open because I don't know of anybody that has really come up. Andy Stern from SEIU has done some good work on global basic income, but I don't know what the solution is going to be. And we're going to have to do a lot of thinking, particularly those of you who are younger, because we're going to have to come up with a solution, and we don't have a lot of time, lest some of the institutions that have served us so well since the Second World War begin to collapse.